Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a tutorial for this red rose watercolor painting. This flower is bright, fiery red with golden toned highlights and will definitely be a standout painting once you're all done. For this painting, I'm using Arches Rough 140-pound watercolor paper, Da Vinci watercolors, a size 0 round brush from Winsor & Newton Cotman, and a size 4 brush from Princeton's Velvet Touchline. I will talk a little bit more about the supplies I'm using throughout this video, but for a more detailed list of materials as well as links, please check the description box down below. Now to get started with this painting, I went back and forth on the techniques I used when painting this, but I will mainly focus on the methods that I found most effective in this video. As you can see, I started out with really just mapping out some of the darker colors in this flower. This can be a really great method for subjects like this, where you may have a dense or detailed pencil drawing that you would like to preserve. It can also be great for when you want to further map out a subject before you get into the bulk of your painting. This can, however, be a slow-going process to carefully and painstakingly glaze or layer all of the color, texture, and detail of the petals. The method I switched to and preferred for this painting was to do a base glaze for the subject, then add my details after. This is the most common method in watercolor and probably the one that you're going to be most familiar with. When using this method, you want to choose the best base color that you can for your subject or area. This will vary from area to area, but it will usually be the lightest color other than white in any given area of your subject. The only downside to this is that with subjects like the one we have here, where we don't always have a single perfect match for our glaze layer all the time. With most subjects that have areas of varying color, this isn't a big deal. You can just add the appropriate color where needed. However, with subjects like this one, where the color subtly changes throughout a single section, it can be a bit more difficult. Techniques like wet on wet could be an option for some, but I would recommend this only for people who have experience doing it. It can be a very tricky technique that requires you to know your supplies, water ratios, and pigments. So for beginners, it is very easy and likely that attempting this can lead to your colors mixing completely, resulting in a solid color that isn't correct for any part of the area that you are trying to paint. When I look at our flower, you can tell that most of the highlight color is a warm yellow. That means for most of this painting, a nice golden yellow is a perfect base color for our first layer, as this is the highlight color with most of our petals. For this color, I think a new gamboge or nickel quinacridone gold is perfect. I went with a nickel quinacridone gold because that is what I had in my palette, but feel free to use what you have on hand to mix your own warm yellow. So now that we know what our main base color is going to be, we also need to think about the few areas of our painting that will have a different highlight color. With this flower, it's pink. Now, if we had specific petals that had a pink highlight, that would be different. We could just use our pink as a base layer in those petals. However, with this flower, we have areas mostly towards the ends of our petals that are pink, with the rest being yellow. One option for accomplishing this could of course be to simply ignore it. These are very small areas, and if you choose to do the entire base layer yellow, you definitely could and no one would notice. My personal preference, if I were to do this, would to just pretend like those areas are yellow like the other highlights in the petals. But you could also have them be orange or whatever color you feel like would be best. The second option, as I mentioned earlier, is to do wet on wet blending. However, I strongly recommend you skip this option if you aren't familiar with it. The chances that you will end up with an orange base layer is pretty good if you don't know the technique. If you do decide to do this, I would caution you to use very little water and give yourself a buffer between the two colors to start. By buffer, I mean to leave some water between the two colors to slowly blend it as it dries. Wet on wet is an unpredictable and often unforgiving method that takes on a life of its own while it's drying. I would definitely keep in mind that the colors will continue to move and blend until they are dry. And so while you're painting, leave some white space in the middle to allow for this to happen. It's always easier to go back and add more color, and believe me, we will, than it is to do corrective measures to take color away. The third and recommended technique for accomplishing this look is to use a color mapping for your base layer. I like to start by filling in my petals that are all yellow. These are super easy flat washes to just get out of the way, then let this dry completely. Next, I look and figure out where your areas will be pink in the flower. Start by adding your pink paint to these areas, and I like to make sure to go a little bit further out than where I think I need to go, usually blending with a little bit of water. This allows me to blend my two base colors a bit later. Remember, we're doing this wet on dry, so the pink will dry first. Always remember to let your paint dry between steps. After the pink paint has dried, we can fill in the rest of the petals with yellow. Keep in mind that this is just a base layer, so any harsh lines that may happen won't be a big deal, as they really won't be visible in the final painting. However, if you are worried, you can either leave a bit of white space between these two areas, or you can blend them in. I choose to do a little bit of blending by flicking my brush in a direction that followed the grain of the petal. Again, we want to be careful to not mix or glaze these areas where we don't want the color to be changed. I find it best to leave more room for blending later than not enough early on. Remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. So now that the base layer is done and completely dry, we can start getting into the details of our flower. But before we can start painting, let's talk a little bit about colors we need quickly. This flower is very warm, very bright, and has some pretty good contrast and depth in it. One thing I would recommend is trying to find transparent colors for this painting. This will help keep our painting looking bright and luminous. This is a bit difficult with the colors that we are looking at in this painting, but check the labels of your paints to see if what you have is transparent or semi-transparent. Try to avoid opaque colors if you can. If you don't have anything in your collection that would work for this, try seeing if you could mix colors instead. If you've watched and followed along with any of my Perfect Trio series videos, then you might already have the colors you need. I would allow yourself to get reacquainted with your mixing scales again if you are out of practice. The yellow to pink scale will have all of the golden yellows, oranges, and reds that you need for this project, and as a bonus, they are going to be very transparent and luminous. After that, you should work on your 3-color mixes to make the muted reds, oranges, browns, and near black colors. If you are mixing your colors from a trio, or if you just have a lot of mixing to do to get the colors you need, I always recommend to mix up big batches of colors to use throughout your project. Watercolor is a medium that is able to be reactivated repeatedly and endlessly, so don't worry about mixing these and having them dry on your palette. They will always be good later. I chose to use prepared pigments that are already close to what I need. Like I mentioned, I use Da Vinci watercolors, so the colors I chose in my palette were alizarin crimson, nickel quinacridone gold, quinacridone burnt orange, plus some greens, purples, and browns for mixing. Again, check the description box down below for a more detailed list. Once you have the colors ready, we are finally able to get into the bulk of our painting. I chose to do this one petal at a time and work my way throughout the entire flower, but feel free to work on this in whatever order feels most comfortable to you. At this point in the painting, I will almost exclusively be using my smaller number 0 brush. Feel free to use the size brush that fits your drawing or to use what you already have. I find that practicing with larger brushes, building up that muscle memory with just using the very tip of your bristles, and to build techniques that allow you to stretch your tools further can be helpful. So if you only have larger brushes, just take some time to learn and to use them with smaller details. Now, with my smaller brush, I want to start building the values and depth in the painting. And to do this, I wanted to start closer to what I thought a midtone might be. I chose a nice, warm red to glaze my second layer with. When I'm painting, I'm thinking about the colors and structure of my petals. So I want to be mindful of my paint strokes. As I'm painting, I'm keeping in mind that I only want to add color where it's needed. This is a lot easier with this color since it's basically our midtone, and our midtone makes up most of our subject. We can always paint into our darker areas of our petals. I even encourage this as it helps to build the depth of the entire petal. However, we do want to be very careful not to paint into our lighter or highlighted areas. We are only focusing on where our medium warm red should be. As we are painting, we are also keeping a few other things in mind. Our first glaze was the base for our color, but the second glaze is the base for the structure of our flower. While we are painting, we are keeping a few things in mind. I want you to focus on the texture in the petal. If you look at the reference or at any photo of a flower, you will see that there is a distinguishable and directional grain within the petals. This isn't necessarily stark or high contrast lines, but it is a noticeable texture in the petals that flows from the inside out, from the base of our flower to the ends of our petals. Also notice that these aren't harsh straight lines. These are flowy and organic, just like our subject. They have some natural variance to them, and they aren't perfectly parallel, but they still flow in the same general direction. This is what we are focusing on right now. We want to start creating that same grain in our painting. This helps us with not only recreating the subject accurately, but compositionally, as it helps the viewer's eye to travel from the center of our flower out. A second benefit to creating this grain texture is just that, texture. We are creating what will give this painting its depth and its interest. As we layer this texture with all of our glazes going forward, we are creating an immense amount of depth, and this helps us a lot as we create the depth and keep the highlights throughout this process. So, now that we know that, and we are remembering that while we paint, how do we achieve it? Well, I like to start in my area of darkest color. In this case, it will be in the overlap of the petal that is on top of it. I'm applying my paint along that top petal, and then I'm flicking my brush outward, feathering out my paint. This flicking or feathering motion is going to be our petal's texture, so this is the motion that we want to be very careful with. I don't want you to worry too much, since by the end of this we will have done a lot more glazing in these areas, but I also don't want you to go from side to side against the petal texture. Any inconsistencies or mistakes can be corrected later, so don't get discouraged, but also try to be mindful with every brushstroke. We will continue this technique of applying our color at its darkest point and flicking outward. This can be done towards the base of our petals and at the outside of our petals quite easily. However, you may also be asking about the darker sections in the middle of our petals. For this, I recommend using a drier brush than you would for an edge, and to keep your strokes small at first, then bigger as you feather outward. We are trying to use up the paint on our brush, essentially drying it out before blending further out. This method is sort of like dry brushing, except we are doing this technique while pulling from a wet area. As we spread out the paint more and more on our brush without adding any more paint or water to it, we are drying our brush out. This creates more textured and feathered areas, and in return, the softer the blending will be. This creates our petal grain and our gradients. One thing that we are doing right now is differentiating our petals. This is slightly less important to keep in mind while you are working one petal to the next. However, if you are working with one color at a time and building up your entire painting gradually, you will want to keep the integrity of your sketch as we go. The sketch is the framework for our painting, and if we lose that, we are left trying to figure out where our lines and shapes are. This can lead to a distorted painting, as you don't know where one shape begins and ends. If you are building your painting as you go, be sure to focus on the inner part of the petals, or the shadow overlap, to keep them separate as you go. Either way, in whatever order you are doing it in, finish the glaze and then let it dry before moving on. From here, we will be working on getting darker and darker with our colors. These colors will vary from petal to petal. This is where we want to pay attention to our reference photo, but the techniques we will be using are exactly the same. I want to focus on gradually getting darker in my shadow areas, but I definitely did skip around to areas that I felt like needed more color or detail that I felt would better help me map out my painting. If you are curious about what I mean by mapping, it means I'm adding specific details to my painting to allow me to quickly reference what part of the painting I'm in. Think about this how regular maps give you landmarks and city names to figure out your position quickly. This is the same idea. In this case, adding shadows or highlights lets me better understand the surrounding areas in my petal, so I can quickly see and add details or colors without always having to study my reference versus my drawing to quickly figure out where I am. Since I'm getting darker with my paint color, I want to work in values that accurately show the depth and changing color. For some areas, a slightly cooler red is exactly what I need. In other areas, I want something a bit desaturated to show shadows. Some of my favorite colors were alizarin gold, pyrrole red, alizarin crimson, and perylene maroon. The alizarin gold from Da Vinci is a really nice warm yellow, but most importantly, it's transparent, so I commonly used it with a PV19 pigment to bring it closer to red for my painting. Pyrrole red is a really good, warm, bright red, but I find it to be a bit too opaque for glazing in some dilutions. So for this painting, I used it sparingly. For this third glaze, perylene maroon was a great shadow color. It has a very warm but desaturated quality to it that allowed for quick shadow details. It was definitely better as a medium shadow color. For darker shadows, I often mixed with greens like perylene green or sap green. Dioxazine violet and occasionally raw umber were great mixes as well. I used the same techniques that we used for our second glaze, which was applying my color, then flicking or feathering outward for the remainder of the painting. Again, pay attention to the reference photo. This will help you understand the lighting. In this reference, you will see a lot of shadow as the petals overlap, and also some shadows as the petals fold away from the light. This means it's easier to find an edge to blend with if you're a beginner. Once we have our darker areas in place, I wanted to work a little bit on the lighter areas. We already have a nice golden color in these areas, but I want them to be a bit warmer and a bit more vibrant, and I want them to be blended a bit better. Since quinacridone gold has such an amazing dynamic range, meaning we get a good range between yellow and orange, I want to use this in varying dilutions to get a better blend while keeping our yellow color. Remember, New Gamboge is great for this too. I also wanted to blend these a little bit like I mentioned earlier, so mixing my quinacridone gold with my alizarin gold really helped me with that blending. One thing I do want to mention is that we are only trying to blend these areas, not completely cover them. We want to try to keep them as bright, light, and luminous as possible. Now that we are almost done with our painting, make sure that the edges of your petals are clearly defined. We want each petal to pop and to see the visual separation from each of the other petals around it. If your flower is looking a bit soft or flat, take some time to better define these areas. One helpful tip is to use your shadows. Once you're happy with your painting, just pin it up and enjoy. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, I would love it if you would like this video, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and feel free to share this video with anyone who may find it helpful. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!